Hello and welcome to X Cult Ed, the podcast where I share my experiences, thoughts and feelings after leaving the truth, otherwise known as the 2x2 way, the fellowship, the one true way. You get the picture. My hope is that in sharing this it will be cathartic for me and perhaps make you, dear listener, feel less alone if you've been through or are going through something similar. This is my story. This is the second episode that I made a few years ago, which explains the term professing, as well as the 4-day annual conventions that we would attend, and how baptism worked in the cult. I mentioned professing in the last episode of this series. I think only people in the religion really know about this word, but it is the initial phase of being part of the church. Entering the church, or God's way as we called it, involved attending the missions and hearing God's word spoken by the preachers. Generally, you attended the missions either because you were brought up in the religion and you attended with your parents like I did, or you got an invite in your letterbox, which we did once or twice a year. Actually, that was really fun. Us kids would all be invited to letterbox dropping days, and we'd turn up and we'd be given a stack of invites and a map which had drawn on it exactly which streets we were to go down. So we'd run around putting invitations in everybody's letterboxes and thinking we were doing such important work. And we generally all went to Macca's afterwards, so it was a great day of exercise and junk food. Anyway, you attend the missions and listen to God's word spoken by the preachers, and then once or twice a year the preachers would do what they called testing the meeting. They would announce that if anybody felt compelled to serve the Lord, that they would stand to their feet during the last verse of the last hymn in the mission. I professed when I was 10 years old, and I remember standing up shaking in front of all these people and feeling like my world had completely changed. After the mission, everyone was congratulating me and saying, "Well done" and "Welcome, sister," and I just felt so special. Professing basically means you're committing to serve God and follow the rules of the religion for the rest of your life. It's a commitment to God before others. It's like a contract you're making to follow Jesus. Baptism that comes later is like signing the contract. Once you're baptized, you can never go back. Actually, we used to sing a hymn that said, "I cannot now go back, I cannot now go back." It's kind of like engagement and getting married. Professing is like the engagement period, and baptism is like the marriage, where it's like till death do us part. So once you're professing, you get to take part in the fellowship meetings, like the Sunday morning meetings and the Wednesday night reads that I described in the previous episode. This means that you now stand up and pray in front of people, and you have to prepare a testimony 2 times during the week. But you don't get to have the bread and the wine yet. That comes when you get baptized, which brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is conventions. Once a year we would all go to convention, and this was a really big deal. Everybody looked forward to convention. We were all so excited about it. And even though I'm not in the religion now, I still think about conventions nostalgically. Each state has about 3 or 4 conventions that are attended by around 300 to 400 people. They're normally held between October and January, so before October you have to tell the elder of your meeting which convention you're going to attend. People in the religion tended to be a bit cliquey, so when I grew up there was a posh convention and a less posh convention, and Mum and I went to the less posh convention, by the way. It was so much better. Anyway, convention was a really awesome place. The way it was set up was that there was a men's side and a ladies' side, and by that I mean sleeping arrangements. So the men would sleep on one side of the grounds and the ladies would sleep on the other side. We all stayed in tents or shearing sheds. Conventions were held on rural properties, so there were often sheep sheds that the men would sleep in. The rest of us would sleep in white identical tents that had been set up before the convention. There was also a shower block, a dining shed, and a meeting tent or shed. As you pulled up in your car, you would be told which tent or shed you were sleeping in. So this was the time where you would find out who you were going to be sleeping with in the same tent. Families would be split up, of course, with the men going to the men's side and the women going to the ladies' side. And because it was just Mum and I, our tent would have someone else in it usually. So you'd hope that she was nice and that she didn't snore or fart in her sleep or something like that. Anyway, you'd make your way to your tent and you'd unpack for the 4 nights that you were going to be sleeping there. The tents were all numbered, so you'd memorize your tent number so that you could tell your friends, "Come and visit me, I'm in tent number 14. Another memory that I have of the tents is that sometimes during October the weather would get quite warm, and being in tents it would be quite hot. I have memories of walking through the rows of tents and trying to not look in the tents because there would be all these old ladies who had their tents open and they'd be sitting there in their big white knickers with their feet in bowls of water to try and cool down. Anyway, after you'd found your tent and unpacked, you would go and check the jobs list. At convention, everybody got a job, and these would range from small jobs for the children such as filling water jugs, setting tables, sorting cutlery, to jobs for the teenagers such as waiting tables, pouring tea and coffee, and then the more adult jobs such as working in the kitchen, doing the washing up, doing the laundry, cleaning the toilets, whatever. There was a job for everybody. Convention would go from Wednesday to Sunday with a clean-up day on Monday for those who could stay the extra night. So most people would arrive on Wednesday afternoon before the evening meeting. Convention was supposed to be a quiet place away from technology and the world. There was no computers, no phones, no radios, so it was just you and the trees and the birds and your Bible, and 400 other people, of course. Although it probably sounds crazy, it was actually a very special time, and we all wanted to live there forever. But of course we couldn't because we had to go out and spread the light with the rest of the world. So often after unpacking, walking around, meeting people, you'd go and clean yourself up at the shower block. There would be about 3 or 4 showers between 150 to 200 ladies. So you'd have to get up pretty early if you wanted to have a shower without waiting in line for half an hour. Mum and I often used to go at around 6 a.m. I want to tell you about the showers at the convention where I used to go to as a child, the first convention I ever went to. So there was 3 showers, but they each had a changing room on either side of them. So you would go into the changing room and you would wait while the other person used the shower. They had frosted glass, but it was only frosted in the middle, so you could normally see the other person's legs in the shower next to you. You would wait until you heard them get out on the other side, and normally they would yell out that it was all clear. Then you would open your side and get into the shower and they could see your legs in there. So you would hope that the other person didn't have a child that would just rip the shower door open and you'd both be standing there naked staring at each other awkwardly. You would also hope that you didn't get into a changing room with someone in the shower who took forever because you'd be standing there naked for ages, freezing cold, waiting for your turn. Anyway, every meal at convention had 2 sittings, a first sitting and a second sitting. This was because people would sometimes have jobs over one of the sittings so that way they could eat at the other sitting. It was also because our tables were in rows and you could only fit 8 people to a side, and the dining shed normally had about 16 tables. The worst was if you had to work over first sitting, because then you had to listen to everyone else eating and smell all the food and be really hungry until second sitting, which I had a lot of trouble with as a child. Anyway, when it was dinner time, we would all crowd around outside the dining shed, kind of like cattle in a holding pen. The tables would be set, the food would be wheeled out and placed on them, and then someone would open the door of the dining shed and we would all just file in. And when I say file in, I mean charge in, like mad cows, all looking for a seat. Sometimes rude people would reserve seats by either placing a piece of fruit on the plate or crossing the cutlery across the plate. So you would go to a seat and realize that you couldn't have that seat, and then generally all the other seats had been taken, so you had to do the walk of shame out of the dining shed while everyone else looked at you because you were too slow and you had to eat at the next sitting. So once everyone had sat, a man would call out what grace we were going to sing, and we would sing it. Now, singing grace was a holy thing, so wherever you were in the convention grounds, when you heard that the people were singing grace, you would stop what you were doing and bow your head. And when I say stop what you were doing, I mean completely freeze. If you were midway walking to the toilet, you would just stop. If you were having a conversation, you'd stop talking mid-sentence. If you're about to wipe your butt, you wouldn't do it until the grace had been finished. People washing dishes would freeze halfway through what they were doing, maybe just holding a plate in the air because they didn't want to be the person who did the accidental cling of a plate and ruin the whole grace. It was kind of like playing musical statues, the game we used to play as a kid. After first sitting, everyone would clear out, and the people whose job it was to clear the table would do so, and then the other people who had to set the tables would also do that, and then more food would be put on the tables, and the whole thing would be repeated again. Mad cow charged for seats, singing of grace and musical statues, and scoffing in the food and filing out. At convention, there were 3 meetings. They were called meetings because they weren't missions open to the public. Each meeting was approximately 2 hours, and we would have all the workers in the state attending, as well as some interstate workers and overseas workers. When we arrived at convention, we would be given a list of speaking workers, so we knew exactly who was speaking on what day. Every worker from the state would speak once, and interstate and overseas workers would speak twice. Each meeting also had a time for the friends, the normal people, to give testimonies. The meeting tent or shed was set up with a microphone at one end and 2 chairs either side of it. On one side of the chairs, the brother workers would sit in rows facing the stage, and on the other side, the sister workers would sit. So they'd basically be opposite each other. 2 brother workers would sit on the chairs on either side of the microphone. They would be the ones who would run the meeting. Then there were rows of benches facing the front, which all of us friends would sit in. Which reminds me, when we first arrived at convention, another thing we would do is take a towel or a rug and use that to reserve our seat in the meeting tent or shed for the rest of that convention. The structure of convention went like this. You would wake up early in the morning to the sounds of birds chirping and the wind in the trees and maybe quiet whispers of people talking in the surrounding tents. You would get up and go for your shower, and then you would get dressed and get ready to go down to the breakfast shed. When you got close to the breakfast shed, you could smell the smoke from the ovens and the smell of fresh stew and porridge being cooked for breakfast, which was delicious. The porridge and stew were cooked in these big vats, I would call them, because you're cooking an amount for 300 people. So you'd sit outside the breakfast shed eyeing off the boys and hoping you looked pretty, because convention was a place where you would often meet your potential match for the rest of your life. Of course, that's not why you were at convention, but it's a great place to meet people if you're a young person. So then you would eat breakfast and hopefully you could get a seat at first sitting, and then you'd do your job, see if your friends needed help with their jobs, and then you'd go brush your teeth and head back to your tent and get ready for the morning meeting. Then you'd have the morning meeting and you'd line up for lunch and you'd have lunch. After lunch, often people would go walking down the driveway of the convention grounds. Now, I should mention that at convention, it was like this weird fashion show out in the bush. So people would often go shopping just for convention and buy special clothes. Even though we were way out in the middle of the bush, everyone would wear high heels. And by everyone, I mean the women. The men would wear suits and suit shoes, whatever you call them. So if you were a woman and you'd been wearing high heels to the morning meeting, it would be ideal to go back to your tent and put on some sensible shoes before going for a walk. But some people went by the motto, no pain, no gain, and they would go walking in their high heels, which I think was crazy. Anyway, then you were supposed to go read your Bible or just be quiet and reflective before the afternoon meeting. You'd go back and wait outside the meeting shed or tent and maybe talk to your friends, but of course you would get really quiet before meeting time. You would know that it was close to meeting time because all the conversations would die down to whispers because nobody wanted to disturb the peace. And then after the afternoon meeting, of course, you'd line up for dinner, and then after dinner you would have the evening meeting, and after the evening meeting came the best meal of the day, which was supper. Supper was so special because we would all go in together. The reason we would all go in together was that we didn't have plates for supper, we all just had a cup. It would either be a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. So because of that, there was no limit to how many people you could fit on a table. So you'd all go in, squish up real tight. Hopefully you were next to the guy or girl you liked because you could be so close to them without it being weird. And then we would all just laugh and talk and have a nice drink. And by drink, I mean tea or coffee. No alcohol, of course. And some biscuits or cake. After supper, people might go for a night walk, especially the young people who wanted to spend a bit of time together. But you had to get back at a decent time because the lights would be turned off, maybe around 9 o'clock. And if you weren't in bed by 9 o'clock, it was really hard to find your tent in a row of white tents that all looked identical. Because remember, we're out in the middle of the country here, so there's no artificial light. Which reminds me, convention was a great place for viewing the stars. So that brings me to baptism. Baptism would happen on a Saturday at conventions. To get baptized, you had to first be professing. And generally, you would have to be professing for at least a year. But when you thought you were ready to become baptized, you would speak to one of the workers, and if they thought that you were also ready, then you would be baptized. The baptism itself consisted of going to a dam or a river, either in the early morning or later in the day, depending on which convention you were at. Generally, your friends and family would attend. At some conventions, basically anyone who was interested would attend. So if you were a guy, you would be prepared by the brother workers, and if you were a female, you would be prepared by the sister workers. So for me, when I was baptized, preparation involved putting on some old clothes supplied by the sister workers, and then having those clothes pinned between my legs so that when I walked into the water they wouldn't fly up, because again we still wore skirts even though we were going into the water because females didn't wear pants. Then you would get into cars and drive to the dam if it was too far to walk, and when you arrived, all the people who were going to observe the baptism would generally already be there with their hymn books. So 2 brother workers would walk down into the middle of the dam, and one of them would announce a hymn which everybody would start singing. As they were singing, the boys would go first, I think, because they could be cold for longer. So one of the boys would walk down to the brother workers, they would turn around and face everybody and cross their arms over their chest, and the brother workers would dip them back and then they would walk out. This would be repeated until each person was baptized, and as you came out, the workers who prepared you would be waiting for you with a towel, and then then you would get back into the car and go back to the convention grounds. Normally the showers would be reserved on that day for only those who were baptized, so you could go straight into the showers and have a warm shower. Compared to professing, which is in the missions in front of everybody, baptism was more of a quiet and personal thing. So not everybody knew who had been baptized. So the rest of that day would normally be filled up with people trying to guess who'd been baptized. You would often look for the person with the wet hair and assume that it was them. And you would also hear a lot of, "Oh, did you hear that so-and-so had been baptized? How lovely, her mother must be so happy." Sometimes those who'd been baptized would give their testimony on the day. That was generally what happened, but not all of them would mention that they had been baptized, and it was never officially announced who had been baptized. I have to say it's a very surreal experience walking down into a dam with all these people standing around singing and getting baptized. It's something that I can't really explain. You sort of again feel very special for that day because you rock up in the car, just you and your fellow baptees or baptizees, whatever you would call them, and then you leave again in the car with your fellow baptizees. And of course everyone's trying to look in the car and see who's getting baptized, and you just feel kind of, maybe that's how the Pope feels when he's driving around in his Pope-mobile, except everyone knows who the Pope is. I don't know, you just feel special. So on Sunday everybody would pack up and leave except those who were staying for cleanups on Monday, and cleanups involved packing up the tents and packing up the bed frames and mattresses and whatever. It was really fun for us kids. Something else I also want to mention about convention is how we passed the time. Most of the time we were in the meetings or eating, but in the time in between that, people didn't play games or anything. You would think anytime there's a big group of young people, someone would bring a ball and people would be kicking a ball, but there was no games allowed at convention. It was supposed to be a serious place where people reflected on their service to God or their relationship with God. So any spare time was supposed to be spent praying and reading your Bible and getting closer to God. One of the conventions that I used to attend in Victoria was held over Christmas, and it was like Christmas never existed. Nobody would talk about Christmas, nobody would wish each other Merry Christmas, there was no gift giving, nothing. It was just like another normal day at convention. And if your birthday happened to be at convention, there would be no fuss about that either. It was basically like anything outside of God's way didn't exist at convention. Its sole focus was just on your relationship with God. Well, that's what it was supposed to be on anyway. I do have to say as well that there was a certain atmosphere about convention that you can't really replicate elsewhere. We would often say that we were leaving the atmosphere of convention, but we could take the atmosphere with us. And I believe that that is something that is true. When I would go back to school, I would feel completely different for maybe even a week. I would just feel very separate from the rest of the world. It was a weird feeling driving out of convention and seeing other cars again and other worldly people. And often the first thing a lot of us would do would be to go to a fast food restaurant because we just had a diet of porridge and cold meat and salads and bread and jam and some fruit for a few days. And just living on that same diet all the time, you just really want some Maccas or something. So we would normally go into a fast food restaurant on the way home, and then the first thing you would hear is the radio playing, and you would see all these people dressed in their worldly clothes, and you would just feel so completely different. You would feel completely out of it, like you were stepping from one world into a different world. Because convention was so quiet, there was no phones and none of the sounds and stimulation that we have all the time in our everyday lives. So being deprived of that, and even though it was only 4 days, you felt like it was such a long time. And going back into the world, away from convention, it just felt like it was overwhelming your senses. You kind of wanted to keep yourself away from those things. Like you would have this tendency to want to avoid worldly things and worldly sounds. You would even get home and just not want to go onto the computer and not want to pick up your phone. You just wanted to keep that sense of quiet and peace with you for as long as you could. And the last thing I wanted to share with you today was special meetings. So special meetings were kind of like convention, but they were just one day in the middle of the year. And everybody would attend a hall together and attend 2 meetings for that day. So there'd be a morning meeting and an afternoon meeting. And in between, we would all have lunch. So normally people would pack their own lunches. Most people would take soup and sandwiches and then like a slice for dessert dessert and maybe they would share the dessert with each other. My mum often made chicken and corn soup, which was delicious, and we would have that in the thermos with some little sandwiches and then maybe a bag of chips or a slice that we'd made or chocolate cake or something. So convention and special meetings were not open to the public. They were for professing people only. That's all I've got to share with you today. Thanks for listening to this episode, and in the next episode I'll talk about some of the rules we had in the religion and also explain a bit why I left. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I really appreciate you. If you'd like to reach out, ask any questions, vent, say whatever you need to say, even if that's getting annoyed about something I've said, email me at exculted@gmail.com. That's exculted@gmail.com. And always remember, you can walk your own way, speak your own truth, and live your own life. Bye!